Welcome back, dear friends, to the Crimson Academy's course on the Kitab-i-Iqan. In this section, we're covering paragraphs 257 through 265 of the Kitab-i-Iqan. His Holiness Baha'u'llah describes the constancy and audacity of the Bab in claiming his mission and the ascendancy, the transcendent power and supremacy that he manifested unaided through his revelation. These qualities are further proofs of the revelation of the Bab. Indeed, such audacity and daring cannot be manifested but through the power of divine revelation. Friends, we're going to share with you 5 key points from these paragraphs. The first key point: the constancy of the Bab in claiming his mission and station is viewed as another proof of his revelation. The next key point: the audacity and daring shown by the Blessed Bab cannot be manifested but through the power of divine revelation. Next key point: in the Qayyum al-Asma, the Blessed Bab predicts his martyrdom in the path of his beloved. And the fourth: steadfastness in a belief regardless of the resulting sacrifices and challenges is an evidence of the truth of that belief. And the last key point: the ascendancy, the transcendent power and supremacy that the Bab manifested through his revelation without any aid is another evidence of the truth of his revelation. His Holiness Baha'u'llah refers to the constancy of the Bab in claiming his mission and station as further proof of his revelation. This quality is particularly awe-inspiring when we consider the Bab's youthfulness. At the age of 25, he claimed to be the promised Qayyam, for whose coming Shia Islam had been praying for more than 1,000 years. Even the thought of such a claim is bewildering, to the extent that any person would still hesitate to venture upon so awful an enterprise, even were the hearts of all men to be crowded into his heart. The proceeding of the examination of the Bab in Tabriz by the Muslim clergy is a powerful evidence of the audacity of the Blessed Bab. This gathering was held in the residence and in the presence of the governor of Azerbaijan, Nasruddin Mirza, the heir to the throne, the ecclesiastical dignitaries of Tabriz, the leaders of the Sheikhi community, the Sheikhul Islam, and the Imam Jume of Tabriz. The chair of the meeting was Haji Mullah Mahmud, the Nizamul Ulama, the prince's tutor. And friends, we find this reference in God Passes By, page 21. Upon his arrival, the Blessed Bab observed that every seat in that hall was occupied except one, which had been reserved for the Wali Ahd, the heir to the throne. He greeted the assembly and without the slightest hesitation proceeded to occupy that vacant seat. The majesty of his gait, the expression of overpowering confidence which sat upon his brow, above all, the spirit of power which shone from his whole being, appeared to have for a moment crushed the soul out of the body of those whom he had greeted. A deep and mysterious silence suddenly fell upon them. Not one soul in that distinguished assembly dared breathe a single word. At last the stillness that brooded over them was broken by the Nizam-ul-Ulama. "Whom do you claim to be?" he asked the Bab. "And what is the message which you have brought?" I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word and to pledge allegiance to my person. Immediately after he had declared himself to be the promised one, a feeling of awe seized those who were present. They had dropped their heads in silent confusion. The pallor of their faces betrayed the agitation of their hearts. Mullah Muhammad, that one-eyed and white-bearded renegade, insolently reprimanded him, saying, "You wretched and immature lad of Shiraz, you have already convulsed and subverted Iraq. Do you now wish to arouse a like turmoil in Azerbaijan?" "Your Honor," replied the Bab, "I have not come hither of my own accord. I have been summoned to this place." "Hold your peace," furiously retorted Mullah Muhammad, "you perverse and contemptible follower of Satan." "Your Honor," the Bab again answered, "I maintain what I have already declared." And friends, we find this in the Dawnbreakers, pages 316 through 317. In paragraph 257, His Holiness Baha'u'llah highlights that the audacity and daring manifested by the Blessed Bab had no origin but the power of divine revelation. What else could be the source of such courage, or the motivation behind such a claim? Do the enemies of the Bab accuse him of folly as they accused the prophets of old? Or do they maintain that his motive was none other than leadership and the acquisition of earthly riches? Baha'u'llah proves the absurdity of such allegations in paragraphs 258 through 262. Initially, he cites a statement from the Qayyum al-Asma, in which the Bab predicts his martyrdom in the path of his beloved. "O thou remnant of God, I have sacrificed myself wholly for thee. I have accepted curses for thy sake, and have yearned for naught but martyrdom in the path of thy love. Sufficient witness unto me is God, the exalted, the protector, the ancient of days." The Qayyum al-Asma is the commentary on the Surah of Joseph, attributed by Baha'u'llah as the first, the greatest and mightiest work of the Blessed Bab. Is his first major writing. The entire work consists of commentaries on the Surah of Joseph in the Quran, in which the Blessed Bab prophesies the coming of the divine Joseph and the remnant of God, later referred in his writings as he whom God shall make manifest. The Bab revealed the first chapter of this book in the presence of Mullah Hussein on the night of his declaration, the 22nd of May, 1844. The Surah of Joseph consists of 100 111 verses. The Bab revealed a surah for each verse. Hence, the Qayyum al-Asma consists of 111 surahs. To the Babis, the Qayyum al-Asma justified the claim of the Bab more than any other of his works, and was considered as the Quran of his community during the early part of his ministry. And friends, we find this reference in Douglas Martin's book, The Mission of the Bab, Retrospective, 1844 through 1994, in the Baha'i World series, pages 94 through 95, and in the Baha'i World in pages 193 through 225. In paragraph 259, His Holiness Baha'u'llah refers to another statement of the Blessed Bab made in the commentary on the letter Ha. This is one of the tablets of the Bab revealed in response to questions asked by a seeker. In this work, the Bab describes his patience and resignation under the sufferings he received, particularly from one of his enemies, Mullah Javed Qasvini Barqani. We find this reference, friends, in Ishraq Qafari's book Kitáb-i-Iqán in Farsi, Volume 1, page 440. In this statement, the Blessed Bab earnestly asks for his martyrdom. Methinks I heard a voice calling in my inmost being, do thou sacrifice the thing which thou lovest most in the path of God, even as Hussein, peace be upon him, hath offered up his life for my sake. And were I not regardful of this inevitable mystery, by him who hath my being between his hands, even if all the kings of the earth were to be leagued together, they would be powerless to take from me a single letter. How much less can these servants who are to take? How much less can these servants who are worthy of no attention, and who verily are of the outcast, that all may know the degree of my patience, my resignation, and self-sacrifice in the path of God. In paragraph 261, His Holiness Baha'u'llah mentions that steadfastness in a belief, regardless of the resulting sacrifices and challenges, is an evidence of the truth of that belief. This is illustrated by hadith from Muhammad. And friends, 2 verses have made me old. This is a reference to 2 verses from the Quran indicating that steadfastness is the most difficult task. And we find this in Ishraq Qafari's book, Kitáb-i-Iqán, Volume 2, pages 912 through 913. And the first reference is from the Quran. It states, "Be thou steadfast, as thou hast been bidden." And this is from the Quran, chapter 11, verse 112. The second reference from the Quran states, "For this cause summon thou them to the faith, and be steadfast, as thou hast been bidden." And we find this in the Quran, chapter 42, verse 15. His Holiness Baha'u'llah then invites the uncle of the Bab to observe the extent of the steadfastness manifested by the Bab, the sadra of the Rezvan of God, and the beauty of God. The Bab's resoluteness was in spite of all the severe tribulations that his enemies inflicted upon him. In paragraphs 263 through 264, His Holiness Baha'u'llah describes other evidences of the truth of the revelation of the Bab. He specifically mentions the ascendancy, the transcendent power, and supremacy that the Bab manifested through his revelation without any aid. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi highlights the events that occurred before the declaration of the Bab and during his ministry, his influence on the learned of his time, and the miraculous condition of his martyrdom are other evidences of the greatness of his revelation. It is not difficult to appreciate the observations of Shoghi Effendi if one considers the events that occurred during the short period of the dispensation of the Bab, and the conditions under which his followers, many of them the most learned of the time, sacrificed themselves to prove their love for him. The chain of events that led Mullah Hussein from being a student of Sheikh Ahmad to his meeting with the Blessed Bab is all very mysterious in nature and clearly providential. Mullah Hussein Bushrui, after his first meeting with the Bab, narrated, "I felt possessed of such courage and power that were the world and all its peoples and its potentates to rise against me, I would alone and undaunted withstand their onslaught. The universe seemed but a handful of dust in my grasp. I seemed to be the voice of Gabriel personified, calling unto all mankind, 'Awake, for lo, the morning light has broken.'" And you find that, friends, in the Dawnbreakers, page 65. Such a mighty impact is evident on all those who met the Blessed Bab. The episodes of Nayriz, Zanjan, and Sheikh Tabarsi, as well as the martyrdom of the Bab's followers, the thousands of martyrdoms of the Bab's followers, and the bravery they showed, all are manifestations of the courage and detachment infused by the Bab into the realities of all his followers. The extraordinary drama of the Bab's martyrdom clearly demonstrates his power and ability to save himself and to overpower his enemies. He accepted death when he was satisfied that his mission was completed. And friends, we find this in Douglas Martin's paper, The Mission of the Bab, Retrospective, 1844 to 1994. This was published in the Baha'i World, pages 193 through 225. In reference to the society in which the Bab appeared, the Guardian states, "Of all the peoples and nations of the civilized world that race and nation had, as so often depicted by Abdu'l-Baha, sunk to such an ignominious depths and manifested so great a perversity as to find no parallel among its contemporaries." And friends, we find this reference in the beloved Guardian's book, The Advent of Divine Justice, page 16. That society consisted of a superstitious and ignorant population, influenced and ruled by a corrupt Muslim clergy, and governed by the barbaric Qajar dynasty. The Bab summoned his followers to a life of integrity and purity. The outcome was astounding. The spiritual transformation that occurred in his followers created a new race of men with attributes and qualities radically different from their fellow countrymen. Edward Granville Brown said, "To the Western observer, however, it is the complete sincerity of the Babis, their fearless disregard of death and torture undergone for the sake of their religion, their certain conviction as to the truth of their faith, their generally admirable conduct towards mankind, and especially towards their fellow believers, which constitutes their strongest claim on his attention." We find this, friends, in E.G. Brown's book, Introduction to Myron H. Phelps, Life and Teachings of Abbas Effendi, revised edition, page 16. Page 16. Very good. Douglas Martin, in his paper that we mentioned earlier, The Mission of the Bab, Retrospective 1844 to 1994, points out that the influence of the Blessed Bab could be observed on the opinion of educated 19th century Europeans. The French literary critic Jules Bois describes it in these terms: "All Europe was stirred to pity and indignation. Among the litterateurs of my generation in the Paris of 1890, the martyrdom of the Bab was still as fresh a topic as had been in the first news of his death in 1850. We wrote poems about him. Sarah Bernhardt entreated Col Mendes for a play on the theme of this historic tragedy." And friends, we find this reference in the Beloved Guardian's book, God Passes By, page 56. Many writers as diverse as Joseph Arthur de Jobonneau, Edward Granville Brown, Ernest Renan, Alexander Tumansky, A.L.M. Nicholas, Victor Rosen, Clement Huart, George Curzon, Matthew Arnold, and Leo Tolstoy were affected by the spiritual impact of the life and martyrdom of the Bab, and they all wrote about him. Thank you, dear friends.